Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Welcome, welcome. So today is the first in the philosophy lecture series of the Mind Foundation. This is a very exciting series that Dr. Chris Letheby has been putting together. I'm going to let him introduce the series in just a moment, and then we'll come back and I'll let you know a little bit more about our speaker today, Dr. Aidan Lyon. So Dr. Letheby.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. So welcome everyone to this lecture series on philosophy and psychedelics. It's being run and organized by the Mind Foundation. My name's Chris Letheby. I'm a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Western Australia and a member of the Scientific Advisory Board to the Mind Foundation. And I'm curating this lecture series on behalf of the foundation. So I want to thank Henrik in particular for inviting me to do this, and everyone at Mind for their work on the series. So our intention essentially is for this lecture series to give an accessible or relatively accessible overview of philosophical issues that arise in relation to psychedelics, psychedelic use, and psychedelic research. And there's going to be 10 lectures, including this one, running between now and December. And our hope, one of our hopes, is to perhaps show philosophers who don't know that much about psychedelics some of the things that are philosophically interesting about psychedelics, and to show people who are interested in psychedelics but perhaps don't know a lot about philosophy some of the ways in which academic philosophy can help us to think about and understand psychedelics and some of the issues that they raise. And we've got an excellent lineup of speakers. We're going to cover all kinds of issues from the conceptual to the epistemological, metaphysical, ethical, cultural, and many, many more. So that's really all I have to say. I'm very excited to kick things off. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jared, who's moderating this session, to introduce our first distinguished speaker in the series.
So our speaker today is Dr. Aidan Lyon. So he is a research associate at the University of Amsterdam and at LMU Munich. He has a background in decision theory and in the philosophy of probability, but also, of course, he does a lot of work on the philosophy of psychedelics. His topic today is the concept of psychedelic experiences, and that's what he'll be talking to you about. In addition to his philosophical work, Dr. Lyon is a consultant in risk management and in psychedelics, and he is the co-founder and director of Delphi Cloud, which is a firm that does research and consulting and training for organizations around the world. With that, I'll let Dr. Lyon take it away.
Thanks. I don't see where to share my screen.
It is at the bottom of the menu. There's like a green arrow.
Ah, there we go.
Yep,
there we go.
Perfect.
See
Looks
everything?
good. Yep.
Nice. Okay, yeah, so today I'm going to talk about the concept of psychedelic experience. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to give you a bit of a synopsis of 4 chapters from my forthcoming book on the topic psychedelic experience. So we'll be looking at just asking the general question of what psychedelic experiences are. Then we'll look at a conceptual analysis that I give of this, of the notion of psychedelic experience. We'll see how that impacts some hypotheses we may have about these experiences. And then towards the end of the talk, I'm going to flip things around. Whereas in the first part of the talk, we'll be looking at how philosophy can help us better understand psychedelic experiences. In this latter part, we're going to be looking at how psychedelic experiences can help us do philosophy. And this is what I call psychedelic philosophy. Okay, so when we think about the meaning of psychedelic, there are 2 common terms floating around these days. The first one is what we might associate with, the concept trippy or mind-bending, hallucinatory, the 60s counterculture, that sort of thing. It's the kind of thing that's portrayed at great length throughout the movie Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. So you can think of it as mind-bending, groovy kind of thing. The second usage is basically the term psychedelic functions as a name. There's a certain class of substances, such as psilocybin, LSD, ayahuasca, 5-MeO-DMT, maybe MDMA. Some people have debates about that one. But the idea is that there's a set of substances that we like to call psychedelics. And so whenever we're using the term, we're just using it to refer to these substances. There's nothing else going on. However, there's a third meaning of the term, and it comes back to the original introduction of the term psychedelic in a paper in 1957 by Humphry Osmond, and he was working closely with Aldous Huxley. There's a series of letters that you can read where they're exchanging their thoughts about how to call these substances. They chose the term psychedelic by building it out of the two components of psyche, which means mind or soul. My computer is frozen. Hold on. And delic, coming from delun, which means to reveal, to make clear or visible, or to manifest. So when they introduced the term, they intended it to mean mind revealing or mind manifesting. So on this meaning, a psychedelic experience is a mind revealing experience. And you can see in the letters between Osmond and Huxley, they really cared about capturing a name, giving them a name that would capture the kind of the effect or the core phenomenological character of the experiences. So at the time, it was quite common to call the drugs in question psychotomimetics. Another name at the time was hallucinogens. But Huxley and Osmond thought these names were inappropriate. And so we see in this letter by Osmond, it is absurd to label them as psychotomimetics. The name should have a clear meaning, be reasonably easy to spell and pronounce, and not be too like some other name. So far, psychedelics, mind manifestors, seems the most promising. Psycholytics, as mind releases, is doubtful because lysis is in medicine and is now associated with dissolution rather than release. Psychedelics seems unambiguous and not loaded with old associations and clear. So there's two things going on here. They wanted a new name that was free of previous associations and would capture the core of the experience. Of course, the 60s came along and changed all of that, and now we have all sorts of associations with the term psychedelic. It's no longer clean and crisp. Nevertheless, I think there's a lot of value in exploring this original meaning of the term and looking at the field of psychedelics from this perspective, from the perspective of the word meaning mind revelation. We see this idea all throughout the literature. So, for example, Stanislav Grof in a book 1980 wrote, "It does not seem to be an exaggeration to say that psychedelics, used responsibly and with proper caution, would be for psychiatry what the microscope is for biology and medicine, or the telescope is for astronomy. These tools make it possible to study important processes that are under normal circumstances are not available for direct observation." In a book, in an edited collection, Manifesting Minds, Rick Doblin and Brad Burge write, "Above all else, psychedelic describes what happens when the contents of the mind and body are made more visible or clear. In other words, when the mind is manifested." Another researcher, Robin Carhart Harris, wrote in a quite famous 2014 paper, "The unique scientific value of psychedelics rests in their capacity to make consciously accessible that which is latent in the mind." 4 years later, in another paper, he wrote, "A principal property of psychedelics is that their ability to reveal aspects of the mind that are normally not fully visible." Okay, so you see this concept, this understanding of the term psychedelic is quite commonplace, especially among researchers. Interestingly, Harris goes on, he writes, "Remarkably, however, that psychedelics do this remains a mere assumption or hypothesis that has never been systematically measured and tested, and therefore given an opportunity to be verified, falsified." So what he's pointing out here is that when Huxley and Osmond were coming up with this term, they had an idea about what the core of the experience was. They thought it had something to do with the mind being revealed or manifested. But just because that had that idea doesn't make it true. It's a hypothesis about what this experience is. And along the way, we've kind of forgotten that. And it's sort of become an assumption that sort of infused in a lot of conversations about psychedelics. But it really is a hypothesis, and so we should be testing it. We should be finding ways to confirm it or to disconfirm it. In order to do that, though, we need to unpack this notion of a psychedelic experience in more precise terms and consider what could be the sorts of things that would be evidence for or against these hypotheses. Okay, so we've got these three meanings or usages of the term psychedelic. What I just refer to as trippy. It functions as a name, just the name of substances. Or it functions as a name, but it's also a hypothesis. There's a hypothesis packed into the name saying, so when we call a substance such as LSD a psychedelic, we're saying that this drug will cause mind-revealing experiences. Okay. Now, unfortunately, the way we're talking about it, the way we talk these days, the term psychedelic the meaning drifts back and forwards these three options. In research, more often it's around 2 and 3, but that creates a kind of vicious circle sometimes. You can think of this as if it really is a hypothesis that these substances are psychedelics, we can't just then say, well, a psychedelic is a drug that causes a psychedelic experience. So we can't have this circularity. If we're going to pursue this idea that is a hypothesis that they cause mind-revealing experiences, then we need to explain what that is independently of the drugs. Otherwise, we get a circularity. This is a bit of a, for some people, this can be a bit of an odd switch in mind. It's a little bit like suddenly seeing everything upside down. It's a simple change, but it takes some time getting used to it. Here's one example to help maybe help kind of make the switch more palatable. Consider what is the opposite of a psychedelic experience. Okay, so if a psychedelic experience is a mind-revealing experience, then the opposite is a mind-concealing experience, and we can call that a psychocryptic experience, coming from the Greek words psyche and kryptos. Psychocryptic experiences are mind-concealing experiences. Now, as far as I can tell, no one's ever mentioned this notion before. But its kind of freshness is useful because it's not attached to any drugs yet. We can understand this idea independently of any substances. Now, eventually, we might want to associate it with certain substances. We might think that sedatives or opiates, they may be appropriately classified as psychocryptic substances. But we don't have to do that. That would be a hypothesis, and it may be right, it may be wrong. So just as we can think about this concept independently of any substances, we can do the same thing for psychedelic experiences. Okay, so now we can start kind of unpacking this term a little bit more precisely. I'm going to fast forward a little bit here, and just looking at the way people use the term. A reasonable way of unpacking the meaning is that a psychedelic experience is a mind-revealing experience. That's an experience in which hidden parts or aspects of the mind are revealed. Now, one example of how that can work is that we could have a distinction between the conscious and unconscious, and say that unconscious contents or processes are brought into conscious experience. For example, there's hidden memories or beliefs, desires, emotions, perceptions, even perspectives. These things are in the unconscious in some sense, and they can be revealed, brought into conscious experience. When that happens, you're having a psychedelic experience. Okay, so note again, there's nothing here about drugs, no mention of LSD, psilocybin, or anything like that. Now, because of that, that opens up the possibility for other hypotheses that we may not have considered. We could think of other things potentially being psychedelics. So, for example, black coffee could potentially be a psychedelic. Here is Henri Poincaré writing about his mathematical creativity in 1904. One evening, contrary to my custom, I drank black coffee and could not sleep. Ideas rose in crowds. I felt them collide until pairs interlocked, so to speak, making a stable combination. It seems in such cases that one is present at his own unconscious work, made partially perceptible to the overexcited consciousness, yet without having changed its nature. So it's a bit counterintuitive, but we see here Poincaré describing this response that he had to black coffee. The parts of his unconscious that were not normally perceptible are now in his awareness because of the coffee. I have a few friends who report having similar experiences with coffee. So It's probably rare, but it's not limited to Poincaré. Okay, it doesn't have to be substances though. Coffee is another substance, but other interventions on the brain or mind could also be psychedelic. For example, meditation is another natural candidate. Here's Steve Jobs writing about, describing his meditative experiences. If you just sit and observe, you will see how restless your mind is. If you try to calm it, it only makes it worse, but over time it does calm. And when it does, there's room to hear more subtle things. That's when your intuition starts to blossom and you start to see things more clearly and be in the present more. Your mind just slows down and you see a tremendous expanse in the moment. You see so much more than you could see before. We don't just have to take Steve Jobs' authority on the matter. A lot of meditative practices are described in these terms. Indeed, for example, Vipassana meditation is often translated as insight meditation or special seeing. It's a way of being more aware of, they don't frame it like this because they use a different set of terminology, but it's a way of being more aware of what's in your mind. Okay, so we've got this idea that psychedelic experience should be understood in terms of a mind revealing experience. There's a bit of a typo here. What I now want to do is like break this idea up even more. What I'm going to do that, the way I'm going to do that is by thinking about how experiences can be more or less psychedelic. So for example, we see here in the meditation quote, you can see things more clearly. You can see so much more than you could see before. And we all have this, we're all familiar with the idea that some psychedelics are stronger than others. They seem to have a more intense, more psychedelic effect than others. Stronger doses as well could do this. So there's this idea that psychedelic experiences come in degrees. Some experiences are more psychedelic than others. So we can unpack that in various different ways, but the way I'm going to look at it during this lecture today is using the term revelation. Revelation can also come in degrees. And by exploring that, we can get a kind of clear perspective of how psychedelic experiences can vary. So here's an example. I'm going to reveal a painting. Okay, but I haven't revealed the entire painting. I've only revealed a small part of it. I could reveal more of it. Okay, I'm going to call this the scope of a revelation. It's roughly speaking like how much stuff, the kind of the breadth of what's there to be revealed is being revealed. Okay, here's another example. I've revealed the painting with the same scope, but because it's now dark, it's harder to see the details of the painting. This is the clarity of the revelation. It's got the same scope as before, but the clarity is now lower, and so you see less. Here's another way to reduce the clarity of a revelatory experience. There can be all sorts of corrupting artifacts over the image, over the painting that's being revealed. Now, in this case, it's quite clear that these don't belong in the painting, but that's not always the case. Some revelations can involve distortions where it's much less clear, and you've got to be paying attention to notice that something's wrong. So, for example, a distortion like this. I've, in a sense, revealed the painting, but I haven't revealed it in its true state. I've distorted it a little bit here. Cliffs don't normally look like that. Okay, so we've got scope and clarity. A third dimension is novelty. So if I keep, let me just go back. If I keep revealing paintings like this, one after another, the next one you would naturally expect is going to be another landscape. There's going to be a mountain somewhere, or cliffs. There's going to be hills, some water, and so on. So there's essentially, if I keep doing this, I'm not really revealing new paintings. I'm revealing sort of some kind of more of the details of my next painting, but you kind of know what's going to come next. Like this. Okay, but what if I suddenly revealed this painting? This would be much more of a shock. You can imagine going to see your favorite artists. They're revealing new paintings every week. And then after 50 landscapes, they reveal this novel painting. This is much more of a revelation. It's a shock. It's like you might even be surprised that this artist is even capable of a picture like this. So this is the novelty of a revelation. The basic idea here is that the kind of how hidden something is or how deeply buried it is, that's its novelty. And so it's more revelatory when you finally get to see it. Okay, so there's one more dimension, and it's called duration. So you got to pay attention for the next one. Here's a revelation. Oh, my computer's my computer's freezing, so it doesn't quite work. Let me just try again. Nope, hold on. There we go. So the curtains pull back very briefly and snap back shut. So there was a revelation, but it was so fast that it wasn't enough for you to process the painting, the details of the painting. So having more time to look at the painting is more revelatory. So this is duration. These are 4 dimensions of what I call psychedelic space. There are 4 ways of ways in which experiences can be more or less revelatory. You could reveal something greater in scope, with more clarity, less corruptions, and more resolution. Novelty, you're not revealing the same thing, it's actually a revelation. And duration, you've got enough time to process what's being presented to you. We can use these 4 dimensions to start kind of charting a map of experiences that can be more or less psychedelic and in different ways. So to illustrate how that can work, I'm going to pick 2 dimensions here, the clarity and novelty. So we're just going to focus on those 2. And I'm going to just put forward 2 hypotheses that we may have. I'm not claiming this is true, but they're illustrative of how we can use these dimensions to kind of bring more resolution to our thinking about psychedelics. So the idea here with this picture down here is that a psychedelic will typically create a psychedelic experience that's high in novelty. It's really good at revealing parts of the mind that are unusual, but it's low in clarity. So although it's revealing something deep in the mind, it may be distorting it in the process. So you're getting a look at something new, but you're not seeing it as it truly is. I'm not saying this is always the case, but you could think of this as maybe the stereotypical experience with psychedelic substances. At the other extreme, that stereotypical experience of meditation is that it's, for a lot of people, they say it's very boring. There's not much going on. Maybe they start to see some things about their mind. They start to see, that how their mind tends to react to certain sensations. Maybe they start to see how their mind is noisier than they thought it was. So a lot of meditative, you can think of the stereotypical meditative session as quite high in clarity, but low in novelty. Not much stuff is being revealed, but whatever is being revealed tends to be of relatively high quality. Okay, so if we think of these 2 kind of ways of creating psychedelic experiences, high in clarity, low in novelty, high in novelty, low in clarity, we could think about ways to combine them. What happens if we make the clear experience more novel, and what happens if we make the novel experience more clear? This would be a way of creating experience that's even more psychedelic than either one. So we can think of how psychedelic an experience is roughly speaking the distance from this origin point. I put the Enso circle here just as a illustration of what might be the most psychedelic experience, but you could think that maybe mystical experiences are around here, right? As you're getting more and more of the mind being revealed and it's getting clearer and clearer, you're getting a special kind of psychedelic experience deep in psychedelic space. Okay, another point about this space, we can think about, so I've been talking about experiences in the distance from this origin point down here, but this origin point can move over time. When it does, this is an argument I can't present in detail here, but in the book I argue that this corresponds to an increase in mindfulness. So before we were just talking about moving from the original kind of default state of consciousness deeper into psychedelic space and then returning to it. Sometimes you stay a little bit deeper. So when this happens is basically an experience here that was psychedelic before with respect to this point is no longer psychedelic. Now, a way of making that more intuitive is that here there is something hidden from your mind that you can't access. And so when it does appear in your conscious experience, it's a revelation. But here, it's not hidden, but it's not necessarily in your awareness. And that's the difference. Another intuitive example to help make this clear, it's a little bit like having lost your keys and then suddenly finding them. That's a key revealing experience versus never having lost your keys in the first place. You just know where they are. You're mindful of where your keys are. So they may not be in your awareness right now. Like I know where my keys are, but I'm not seeing them. But I could easily bring them into my awareness if I wanted to. I could go grab them. So another way of thinking about this is the increase in freedom of access to your mind. Okay, this relationship between mindfulness and psychedelic experience, and especially when we embed it in the framework of psychedelic space, allows us to shine a new kind of light on some of the results coming from the science of psychedelics and meditation. So for example, there's a number of studies coming out now showing that in the appropriate context, psychedelics increase mindfulness and cause long-lasting increases in mindfulness. There's several studies that show this. That's potentially quite counterintuitive if you think about it. Our usual stereotypical association of a psychedelic session is this kind of like the fear and loathing in Las Vegas sort of experience. There's a lot of turbulence, not the sort of thing that we associate with mindfulness. And there's studies that's starting to come out to show that mindfulness also supports or deepens psychedelic sessions. So there's a complementary relationship between the two. Okay, so that is maybe a little bit puzzling, but it makes sense from this perspective. Essentially what's going on is that mindfulness, as you increase in mindfulness, you're moving this origin point deeper into psychedelic space. And it's a kind of moving launch pad for your psychedelic sessions. So if you have a psychedelic that's only going to take you a certain distance into the psychedelic space, you may only get this far, right here where I'm hovering my mouse. Oops. Okay, but if that origin point is, say, much closer to where we might think the mystical experiences are, then it's going to be easier to get into those states with the same dose of a psychedelic. Okay, so there's much more to be said here, but the point is, by taking a step back and looking and taking this more kind of conceptual approach before we start engaging with the empirical literature, some results that might seem a little bit surprising actually look quite natural. Okay. So the last bit of the talk is I want to flip things around. So far we've been doing what I call philosophy of psychedelics. We've been using the tools of philosophy to better understand psychedelics, like what we would do in, say, philosophy of biology or philosophy of physics. I'd like to just draw a distinction between that and psychedelic philosophy. Here we're using philosophy to help us understand psychedelics. Here we can use psychedelics to help us do philosophy. Okay, so I want to be clear about what I'm not talking about. This question, does Western philosophy have its roots in ancient psychedelic practices, has been an idea that has been a question that people have been very excited about. And there are numerous books making a case that philosophy and even Western culture more generally traces back to psychedelic practices in ancient Greece, particularly in connection to the Euclidean mysteries. You could also make the case that some Asian philosophical practices are also rooted in psychedelic practices. So for example, there's Soma mentioned frequently in the Rig Veda. When I'm talking about psychedelic philosophy, I'm not talking about this. In fact, all this stuff could actually be false for the sake of argument. We don't need to assume that philosophy has its roots in psychedelic practices. Even so, to be clear, I think there's a plausible case that it is, but we don't need to assume it is. What I want to argue is that, like, now we can use psychedelic experiences to improve our philosophical practices. So there's lots of different ways to unpack this, but because of like the limitations of time, I'm just going to do one particular way that this can happen. So I think it's very clear when we look at some of Plato's work, particularly his description of Socrates, that psychedelic experiences were the core of his philosophical, his philosophizing. And when I say psychedelic experience, remember, I'm not talking about psychedelic drugs. I'm talking about mind-revealing experiences. This is quite clear, I think, in the passage where Socrates likens his philosophizing to midwifery. So he says, my art of midwifery is in general like theirs, real midwives. The only difference is that my patients are men, not women. I should pause. Unfortunately, there's no way of getting around the sexism there. Obviously, that's not necessary to the main point. And my concern is not the body, but with the soul that is in travail of birth. And the highest point of my art is the power to prove by every test whether the offspring of a young man's thought is a false phantom or instinct with life and truth. The many admirable truths that they bring to birth have been discovered by themselves from within, but the delivery is heaven's work and mine. Okay, so there's two ideas here. One is the kind of philosophical offspring of his interlocutor or his student is already inside his mind. It's already been discovered in a sense, and the job is to bring it out into conscious experience and into conversation, into dialectic. This is the delivery, getting it out. But then there's also the test, proved by every test, whether it's a false phantom or not, right? This is to see if it's true. Now, my impression is when in a lot of conversations about Socrates, they focus on this. They focus on his kind of his tediousness, his nitpicking, the thing that kind of got him into trouble, or at least reportedly got him into trouble, by showing that what people believe was actually not true. But this delivery part of his philosophizing was maybe even more important, but tends not to get as acknowledged as much. Okay, and I think this is quite representative of what's happened in philosophy over time. There's a sense in which we've focused too much on the testing, on the kind of analytic, argumentative side of philosophy, and not on the kind of insight process or the revelatory process. Abraham Maslow makes this point about everyone. So the problem is not just with philosophers. Our conscious intellect is too exclusively analytic, rational, numerical, atomistic, conceptual. And so it misses a great deal of reality, especially within ourselves. So what I'd like to do is distinguish between what we might think of as two methods of doing philosophy. Analytic methods, these are the methods of logic, inductive reasoning, even science. We can bring science under the umbrella of philosophy, perhaps as natural philosophy. Conceptual analysis, all that sort of stuff is over here, analytic methods. What I'd like to do is introduce the idea of psychedelic methods. Just as we've got lots of methods for doing analysis, we've got lots of methods of doing a kind of taking a psychedelic approach to philosophy. Now, the way I'd like to do this is to go through a somewhat lengthy passage by Bertrand Russell, because I think the passage nicely illustrates how Western philosophy gets right up to the edge of psychedelic philosophy, but then stops, doesn't quite get there. So this is a passage from an essay that he wrote called Philosophy for Laymen. And he's talking about emotional biases and how we can use kind of rigorous thinking to protect ourselves from our emotional biases so we can think in a fair and just way about political and social issues. So I'm going to go through this, and on the next slide, we get to the psychedelic stuff. So when in a sentence expressing a political opinion, there are words that arouse powerful but different emotions in different readers. Try replacing them by symbols, A, B, C, and so on, and forgetting the particular significance of the symbols. Suppose A is England, B is Germany, and C is Russia. So long as you remember what the letters mean, most of the things you will believe will depend on whether you are English, German, or Russian, which is logically irrelevant. When in elementary algebra, you do problems about A, B, and C going up a mountain, you have no emotional interest in the gentlemen, of course, could also be women, concerned, and you do your best to work out the solution with impersonal correctness. But if you thought that A was yourself, B was your hatred rival, and C the schoolmaster who set the problem, your calculations would go askew, and you would be sure to find that A was first and C was last. In thinking about political problems, this kind of emotional bias is bound to be present, and only care and practice can enable you to think as objectively as you do in the algebraic problem. So his recommendation here is when we're trying to think about these kind of heavy problems, heavy situations, we should abstract away from the details and think about what principles apply in a general way. That will protect us from our emotional biases. Okay, so that's pretty standard of what happens in philosophy, I think. But Bertrand Russell goes on. Thinking in abstract terms is, of course, not the only way to achieve ethical generality. It can be achieved as well, or perhaps even better, if you can feel generalized emotions. But to most people, this is difficult. If you are hungry, you will make great exertions if necessary to get food. If your children are hungry, you may feel even greater urgency. If a friend is starving, you'll probably exert yourself to relieve his distress. But if you hear about some millions of Indians or Chinese are in danger of death from malnutrition, the problem is so vast and so distant that unless you have some official responsibility, you probably soon forget all about it. Nevertheless, if you have the emotional capacity to feel distant evils acutely, you can achieve ethical generality through feeling. If you have not this rather rare gift, the habit of viewing practical problems abstractly as well as concretely is the best available substitute. Okay, so now we can put these two slides together. What he's alluding to here is that this capacity to feel generalized emotions is perhaps even better than reasoning abstractly. And that reasoning abstractly is in a sense perhaps a substitute for this. But the problem is, for most people, it's difficult. Most people don't have this gift. So we can think of the situation like this. We have an objective. We want to think with ethical generality. On the first slide, Bertrand Russell recommends that we think abstractly about our problems. But then he recognizes that you could also do this by feeling generalized emotions. But the conversation basically stops there. He says, this is hard to do and most people can't do it. Okay. But I think there are methods for doing this. And in fact, there's psychedelic methods. So one way to feel generalized emotions, for example, is to practice compassion meditation. Through this meditative practice, you become more aware and connected to the suffering of all beings. And you feel this over time, you learn how to experience this in a general way. And then, of course, various psychedelics often result in this experience. We see people reporting of feeling more connected to each other and more empathetic and a better understanding of where other people are coming from. So these are two methods, and there are others, two psychedelic methods for enhancing your capacity to feel generalized emotions. That in turn then can help you think with greater ethical generality. Okay, so this general idea, so this was just one example, but this general idea, you can find it in other places as well. So for example, Zoe Helene has written, my theory is that the medicine in this psychedelics helps us communicate with the subconscious parts of our own psyche and to our own deepest inner wisdom. Okay, so there's more to say here, but time is short. I've just given one example of how we can use these psychedelic methods to help us achieve philosophical goals. In the case I gave, it was to think with ethical generality. All right, to summarize. The term psychedelic has different meanings, but its original meaning was mind revelation. The idea that psychedelics are psychedelic is an empirical hypothesis. So read this as, the idea that the drugs that we happen to call psychedelics are actually mind revealing is an empirical hypothesis. It may be false, or it may not be true in the ways that we expect. Other interventions can also be psychedelic. I gave the example of meditation. I think yoga could also be like this, fasting, sauna, and as we saw, coffee could also be psychedelic for some people. Experiences can be more or less psychedelic, and psychedelic in different ways. And in the middle of the talk, I gave some examples of this. They can vary in terms of their scope, clarity, novelty, and duration. And we can use psychedelic methods for cultivating certain kinds of psychedelic experiences to enhance our philosophizing, and ultimately to enhance our wisdom. Okay, that's it. Thanks very much for listening. If you'd like to know more about the book or have comments or questions, feel free to reach out to me.